Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal 350 Climate Action. Our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I'm Jack Ite. On today's show, tribute to the late urban provocateur, Mike Davis, curated by myself and featuring the late author, urbanist, historian, public intellectual, and commentator on politics, labor, activism, and society. Mike Davis, who passed away in 2022, was, as I said, a writer, political activist, urban theorist, and historian based in Southern California. Once a meat cutter and a truck driver, he was professor emeritus at the University of California, Riverside, a MacArthur Fellow, and the author of more than 20 books. He's best known for his investigations of power and social class and works such as City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles in 1990, and Late Victorian Holocaust, 2001, among many others. I want to note that I met Mike Davis as a graduate student when he taught at UCLA in the School of Architecture and Urban Planning while he was writing his incendiary and prophetic shadowing of the social and environmental calamities that the city of Los Angeles and our world at large continues to face. We will begin today with an introduction of Mike Davis, and we'll come back to a question and answer later by Vijay Prashad, an Indian Marxist historian and commentator. This is from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst's History Department Feinberg Lecture Series from 2020.
I'm very grateful to be asked to moderate this event. In fact, I'm deeply honored because Mike Davis is a personal hero, an incredible writer. It's quite fitting, Mike, that you, the emeritus professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, your work is so profoundly beautiful to read. The first Mike Davis book that I read was Prisoners of the American Dream, which to my mind is one of the finest books that explains the political and social impact on the working class in the United States due to the hollowing out of the economy by the wealthy. As powerful was his City of Quartz, a warning of the dystopias, actually, if you think about it, that are produced by turbocharged capitalism that turns its back on the rhythms of human life and of nature. In quick succession came magical urbanism, then one of my great favorites, Late Victorian Holocaust. The titles, I should say, get bleaker and bleaker, Mike. Dead Cities, The Monster at Our Door, Planet of Slums, and then, of course, most recently, The Monster Enters, a book which reprises The Monster at Our Door, takes us from, the early SARS to COVID-19. Mike Davis has won the MacArthur Genius Award, the Lannan Literary Award, and much more. I want to introduce Mike as well with the epitaph from a book I really enjoyed reading called Buddha's Wagon, A Brief History of the Car Bomb. The epitaph for this book comes from Chechnya. And what the epitaph says is, how can you sleep with death just around the corner? It's a question for our times. How can you sleep with death just around the corner? So glad to have your writings, Mike, to console my insomnia.
We now feature a lecture by Mike Davis about his book, Planet of Slums, which investigates the increasing inequality of the urban world. According to the UN, more than 1 billion people now live in extreme poverty of megacities facing environmental and social collapse from perpetual and worsening climate disruptions. Mike Davis explores the meaning and the future of this radically unequal and unstable urban world. This lecture comes from a talk given at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee in 2015.
My talks are often odd, but tonight's ramble is evolved into an impromptu manifesto with 10 theses. I'll fly away on various brief tangents about climate change, the global economy, and utopian cities, yet attempt to land all my ideas in the same spot. The landing zone is located in the wilderness of what the German critical theorist Theodor Adorno called the negative dialectic. That is to say, in a space of unresolvable contradiction, created by the death of humanism in the 20th century, where all realistic extrapolations consistently point to the morally unthinkable, while all the necessary conditions for human solidarity and survival recede to the utterly utopian. Now, this is a space that can't be flat mapped with an unironic and romantic binaries like optimism and pessimism or hope and despair, but must be defined by three coordinates. Two of them are knowable: the nature of the crisis and its solution, that is to say, the calamity and the utopia. But the third coordinate, the means to bring about the solution, the politics of change, is missing. With no army of liberation in sight, critique is futile, yet paradoxically more urgent than ever. As the philosopher Robert Hewlett Kenner put it in an extraordinary essay, Adorno's thinking as a whole is a materialist critique of historical despair. The puzzle it confronts is why the way out looks sealed, when every door, in fact, swings wide on broken hinges. Thesis 1. Let me begin with the most obvious broken hinges: the velocity and direction of historical change. In the 50s and 60s, the acceleration of history was a popular topic in the press as well in academia. Gerald Hill, the founder of Scientific America, wrote a popular book on the subject, probably because the rate of change was so dramatically visible against the slow background of a still largely rural world. At the same time, few questioned the direction of change. Apart from the very great threat of nuclear war, societies, everyone claimed, were rapidly modernizing in a progressive direction toward the elimination of colonialism, illiteracy, poverty, and infectious disease. The science and technology had solutions for every problem. But now change has become so rapid, fundamental, and nonlinear that we're like passengers on a runaway train, not knowing whether the track ahead has been, or for that matter, ever will be built. Universal human progress, whether via 5-year plans or the Great Society, has become an antique and utopian idea. It's been replaced by universal anxiety and a guilty sense that we're in the lifeboat, while far too many of our fellow beings are in the water. I have 4 kids. The youngest pair were born in 2003. In little more than a decade of life, they've witnessed the birth of a new geological epoch in terrestrial climate called the Anthropocene. When they were 5 or 6, the urban population of the Earth exceeded the rural for the first time. By the time my kids are 50 or 60 years old, they'll witness the maximum population of the human species, the final build-out of human demography at about 9.5 to 11 billion people, but no more than that. Now, no generation has ever lived through such a supernova of change. At the end of the 19th century, it was possible to forecast with some accuracy, and some did, the shape of technology and products to come over the next half century. All the fundamental foundation stones, electricity, internal combustion, synthetic industrial chemistry, germ theory of disease, and so on, had already been laid in place, most of them actually in the 1880s. So imaginative extrapolation could make serious predictions. Science fiction hit the nail on the head a surprising number of times. This is not the case today. While in some areas, quantum computing, for example, the broad outlines of the future may be visible to the experts. Other emergent technologies, genomics, robotics, nanomachines, and so on, have potentials for good and bad beyond our current mental horizon. How these potentials are realized, of course, is one of the great moral and political questions of your generation and my children's. The total surveillance society or the digital commons, life extension for the wealthy or free health care for everybody, catastrophic job loss or reemployment in humanly and intellectually enriched vocations. Will the next 1.5 billion souls to be born in your lifetime simply join the wretched of the earth, or through economic equity and social justice be allowed to develop their genius? They could be the angels in our future. Thesis 2. The Pope, of course, recently has had a lot to say about these topics, especially the relationship between climate change and poverty and the irrational reliance on market-based solutions to global human problems. In his extraordinary encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, he warned that, quote, doomsday predictions can no longer be met with mere irony or disdain. We're not faced, he continued, with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. We need to reject a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals. And I think we also need to reject magical thinking about any equation of the interests of nation states and those of humanity as a whole. The underlying fallacy of climate diplomacy based on the endless Kyoto Copenhagen template, it's been the assumption that once the major actors accepted the consensus science embodied in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so this is the huge scientific collaboration that's been set up to develop baseline semi-consensual scientific knowledge for negotiations between states. And once that consensus science was adopted, Rush Limbaugh was agreeing with the Pope about the urgency of mitigating climate change, then everyone would recognize an overriding common interest in gaining control over the greenhouse effect. But global warming is not HGL's War of the Worlds, where invading Martians democratically annihilate humanity without class or ethnic distinction. Climate change instead will produce dramatically unequal impacts across countries, with the biggest impacts in the countries with the fewest resources for meaningful adaptation. Now, if I were in your generation, I'd probably be getting ready to move to Canada right now. Global warming may turn Canada into a superpower, but you wouldn't want to move to Bangladesh. This geographical separation of emission source from environmental consequence undermines any proactive solidarity. As the UN Development Program has emphasized, global warming is above all a threat to the poor and the unborn, the two constituencies with little or no political voice. Coordinated global action on their behalf thus presupposes either their revolutionary empowerment or the transmutation of the self-interest of rich countries and classes into an enlightened solidarity with little precedent in history. Nothing is more unlikely. Instead of galvanizing heroic innovation and international cooperation, growing environmental and socioeconomic turbulence may simply drive elite publics into more frenzied attempts to wall themselves off from the rest of humanity. Global mitigation would be tacitly abandoned, if it hasn't been already, in favor of accelerated investment in selective adaptation for Earth's first-class passengers. The goal would be the creation of green and gated oasis of permanent affluence on an otherwise stricken planet. Of course, there'd still be treaties, carbon credits, famine relief, perhaps, humanitarian acrobatics, even the full-scale conversion of some European cities and small countries to alternative energy. But worldwide adaptation to climate change, which presupposes trillions of dollars of investment in the urban and rural infrastructures of poor and medium-income countries, as well as the assisted migration of tens of millions of people from Africa and Asia, would necessarily command a revolution of almost mythic magnitude in the redistribution of income and power. Thesis 3. Poor countries rightly rail against the notion that the greatest burden of adjustment to the Anthropocene epoch should fall on those who contributed least to carbon emissions and draw on the slightest benefits from 2 centuries of industrial revolution. A recent assessment of the environmental costs of economic globalization since 1961, in terms of deforestation, climate change, overfishing, ozone depletion, mangrove conversion, agricultural expansion, and so on, found that the richest countries generated 42% of the environmental degradation across the world, while shouldering only 3% of the resulting costs. The radical of the South will rightly point to another debt as well. For 30 years, cities in the developing world have grown at breakneck speed without counterpart public investments in infrastructure, housing, or public health. In part, this has been the result of foreign debts contracted by dictators, with payments enforced by the IMF and public spending downsized are redistributed by the World Bank's structural adjustment programs. This is, of course, what happened in Latin America, a whole generation of lost growth we may well now be seeing in Southern Europe and the Mediterranean. Greece looks an awful lot like Argentina or Peru 30 years ago. This planetary deficit of opportunity and social justice is summarized by the fact that more than 1 billion people, according to UN Habitat, currently live in slums and that their number is expected to double by 2030. An equal number or more forage in the so-called informal sector, a third world euphemism for mass unemployment. Sheer demographic momentum, meanwhile, will increase the world's urban population by 3 billion people over the next 40 years, 90% of whom will be in poor cities. But no one, not the UN, the World Bank, the G20, no one has a clue how a planet of slums with growing food and energy crisis will accommodate their biological survival, much less their aspirations to basic happiness and dignity. The most sophisticated research to date on the likely impacts of global warming on tropical and semi-tropical agriculture is summarized in the country-by-country study of William Klein, the kind of famous economist at the Peterson Institute for International Law. Peterson, the conservative, I believe, former Secretary of Commerce. And this is hardly a left-wing think tank in Washington. But Klein's model is the most sophisticated. It uses he uses both crop process and neo-Ricardian farm output models. It's up-to-date tools we have for understanding changes in agricultural productivity and output. And he allows for very optimistic levels of carbon dioxide fertilization. That is, how much additional carbon dioxide will be absorbed in further plant growth. To look at the possible futures through human nutrition, the view is grim. Even in Klein's most optimistic simulations, the agricultural systems of Pakistan, minus 20% of current farm output, and northwestern India, minus 30%, are likely devastated, along with much of the Middle East, the Maghreb, the Sahel, parts of southern Africa, the Caribbean, and Mexico. 29 developing countries, according to Klein, stand to lose 20% or more of the current farm output to global warming, while agriculture in the already rich north is likely to receive, on average, an 8% boost. You may be buying bread that's made out of wheat from Alaska, for example. This potential loss of agricultural capacity in the developing world is even more ominous in light of the UN warning that a doubling of food production will be necessary to sustain the Earth's mid-century population. The 2008 food ability crisis, that's a long time ago, isn't it now? This was the one that was aggravated by the conversion to biofuels and resulted in riots all across the world. That crisis is only a modest portent of the chaos that could soon grow from the convergence of resource depletion, intractable inequality, and climate change. In face of these dangers, human solidarity itself may fracture like a West Antarctic ice shelf and shatter into 1,000 shards. Thesis 4. Scholarly research has come very late in the day to confront the synergistic possibilities of peak population growth, agricultural collapse, abrupt climate change, perhaps peak water in a number of countries, and the accumulated penalties of urban neglect. If investigations by the German government, the Pentagon, and the CIA, and perhaps later in question time, I'll tell you about my conversation I had with Admiral Weizsäcker, the president until recently of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He's also intensely focused on these issues. These investigations into the national security implications of multiply determined world crises have a Hollywoodish ring. It's hardly surprising. As a recent UN development report observed, quote, there are no obvious historical analogies for the urgency of the climate change problem. Now, paleoclimatology, which is the science based on ice cores and cores into sea sediments and using fantastic, subtle methods to gain information about past climates. So paleoclimatology can help scientists anticipate the nonlinear physics of a warming Earth. There's no historical precedent or vantage point for understanding what will happen in the 2050s when a peak species population of 9 to 11 billion struggles to adapt to climate chaos and perhaps depleted fossil energy. Almost any scenario, from the collapse of civilization to a new golden age of fusion power, can be projected on the strange screens of our grandchildren's future. You can be sure, however, that cities will remain the ground zero convergence of these problems. Although forest clearance and export monocultures have played fundamental roles in the transition to a new geological epoch, the prime mover has been the almost exponential increase in the carbon footprints of urban regions in the Northern Hemisphere. Heating and cooling the urban-built environment alone is responsible for an estimated 35 to 45% of current carbon emissions, while urban industries and transportation contribute another 35 to 40%. In a sense, city life is rapidly destroying the ecological niche, Holocene climate stability, which made its evolution into complexity possible.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you are enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Friday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sunday at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website ecojusticeradio.org to check out previous shows and guests. Get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to a tribute to the late urban provocateur Mike Davis, curated by myself, Jack Ide, and featuring the late author, urbanist, historian, public intellectual, and commentator on politics, labor, activism, and society. Mike Davis, Ecology of Fear, Los Angeles and the Imagination of Disaster. Despite the wishful thinking of evangelicals impatient for the rapture, or deep ecologists who believe that Gaia would be happiest with a thin sprinkling of hunter-gatherers, megacities like Los Angeles will never simply collapse and disappear. Rather, they will stagger on, with higher body counts and greater distress, through a chain of more frequent and destructive encounters with disasters of all sorts, while vital parts of the region's high-tech and tourist economies eventually emigrate to safer ground, together with hundreds of thousands of its more affluent residents. And now we continue with a lecture by Mike Davis about his book, Planet of Slums, which investigates the increasing inequality of the urban world. This comes from a talk given at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee in 2015.
5. I'll get to the optimistic. Yet there's a striking paradox here. What makes urban areas so environmentally unsustainable are precisely those features, even in the largest megacities, that are actually the most anti-urban or suburban. First amongst these is massive horizontal expansion, which combines the degradation of vital natural services like aquifers, forests, watersheds, truck farms, coastal ecosystems, you name it, with the high cost of providing infrastructure to sprawl. The result is a grotesquely oversized environmental footprint with the concomitant growth of traffic and air pollution, and most often, the downstream dumping of waste. Where urban forms are dictated by speculators and developers, bypassing any democratic control over planning and resources, the predictable social incomes are extreme spatial segregation by income or ethnicity, as well as unsafe environments for children, the elderly, and those with special needs. While inner city development is conceived as gentrification through eviction, destroying urban working class popular culture and process. To these we may add the socio-political features of the megapolis under conditions of capitalist globalization, the growth of peripheral slums and informal employment. You see, my critique of capitalism as a godless communism, it's not that it exploits the working class, but it doesn't exploit the working class. There are about 1 billion people who have simply become redundant to the world economy. They no longer have any place, like black labor in the South in the 1950s. Having built up a whole society, they then become redundant to its current needs and pushed out except to be unemployed in third world cities. It's not like being unemployed here. There's no provision for unemployment in most countries, so you have to survive somehow. So you create this universe of so-called micro-entrepreneurs like rickshaw walls and day laborers, maids, subsistence criminals, infinity of small food vendors. These are the disguised jobless. But this is, in my mind, a contradiction, a crisis, every bit as fundamental as climate change, which is the breakdown of job creation in the big cities of the world. And urbanization has been occurring at rates higher than during the European Industrial Revolution. It's been occurring since the 1980s under conditions where formal sector jobs, state sector jobs, have been decreasing and populations growing astronomically. And again, concomitant investment in public infrastructure, services to education. By contrast, actually, here's finally the optimistic part. By contrast, those qualities that are the most classically urban, even on the scale of small cities and towns, combine to generate a more virtuous circle. Where there are well-defined boundaries between city and countryside, urban growth can preserve open space and vital natural systems, while creating environmental economies of scale in transportation and residential construction. Access to city centers from the periphery becomes affordable, and traffic can be regulated most effectively. We think that, at least those of us in Southern California, think that gridlock is an absolute nightmare. Have no idea what it is to live somewhere like in Lagos, where the geographical separation from work and residence, from housing affordability and employment is so great, people will spend on the average 4 hours a day getting back and forth from work, and about 17% of low family incomes. And that's a condition. It's, of course, rapidly increasing all through the so-called developing world. The entire increase in the auto population of the world over the next generation will occur in countries like India and so on, that almost are completely immobile already in their cities because of traffic. In the classical urban visions, and this, what I'm about to say, this is the punchline, forget anything else, this is my main point. In these classical urban visions, public luxury replaces privatized consumption through the socialization of desire and identity within collective urban space. There are large domains of public or nonprofit housing, reproducing ethnic and income heterogeneity at fractal scales throughout the city. Egalitarian public services and cityscapes are designed with children, the elderly, and those with special needs in mind. Democratic controls offer powerful capacities for progressive taxation and planning, with high levels of political mobilization and civic participation. The priority of civic memory over proprietary icons, and the spatial integration of work, recreation, and home life. Thesis 6. Now, such sharp demarcations between the good and the bad features of city life, of course, are redolent of famous attempts in the previous century to distill a canonical urbanism or anti-urbanism. Louis Mumford, Jane Jacobs, Frank Lloyd Wright, Walt Disney, Corbusier and the CM Manifesto, the New Urbanism of Andreas Swanning, Peter Calthorpe, and so on. But no one needs urban theorists to have eloquent opinions about the virtues and vices of built environments and the kinds of social interactions they foster or discourage. What often goes unnoticed in such moral inventories, however, moreover, is the consistent affinity between social and environmental justice, between the communal ethos and a greener urbanism. Their mutual attraction is magnetic, if not inevitable. The conservation of urban green spaces and waterscapes, for example, serves simultaneously to preserve vital natural elements of the urban metabolism while providing leisure and cultural resources for the popular classes. What I just said, by the way, doesn't come from Lenin or Karl Marx. It comes from Olmsted, the Republican who designed Central Park and whose sons designed 40 or 50 of the great parks of the United States. This is just old-fashioned wisdom. Reducing suburban gridlock with better planning and more public transit turns traffic sewers back into neighborhoods or streets while reducing greenhouse emissions. Now, there are innumerable examples, and they all point toward a single unifying principle, namely that the cornerstone of the low-carbon city more than any particular green design or technology, is the priority given to public affluence over private wealth. As we all know, several additional Earths would be required to allow all humanity to live in a suburban house with 2 cars and a lawn. And this obvious constraint is sometimes invoked to justify the impossibility of reconciling finite resources with rising standards of living, particularly true amongst my experience amongst environmentalists in California. Most contemporary cities in rich countries are poor, repress the potential environmental efficiencies inherent in human settlement density. The ecological genius of the city remains a vast, largely hidden power. But there's no planetary shortage of, quote, carrying capacity if we're willing to make democratic public space, rather than modular private consumption, the engine of sustainable equality. Public affluence represented by great urban parks, free museums, libraries, and infinite possibilities for human interaction represent an alternative route to a rich standard of life based on earth-friendly sociality. And I'm going to part from part of the text here that refers to obscure Russians and socialist experiments with communal living. Think of a really great university campus. Now, you don't really mind living in a dorm or in small married student housing when you have access to great libraries, fantastic green space, great athletic amenities, unparalleled opportunities for practicing human reproduction. I mean, just think about it. Great universities are little quasi-socialist paradises because you don't need a huge suburban tract or a swimming pool or a 4-car garage. When you have public space and public services of such a high quality, and most of all, such a high degree of, what the utopian socialist Fourier would call human affinity, multiple learning and debate. And I mean, this is why I think for a lot of us, there's something about college or university, it's nostalgic, not only because of nostalgia for the age we were, but a nostalgia for the kind of life we had that we're not easily going to find again. It also goes without saying that there was a deep communitarian instinct in American history. So many of us descend from people who came not as individuals or entrepreneurs or single families. We came as parts of communities. Even if taken by force and great violence, our roots are still communitarian. And I must tell you that liberals and the left have totally failed, in my opinion, to address the real issues of community or the importance of family life. And which is why I think a lot of working class people in this country have deserted the Democratic Party. But the American experience is interesting because there was one occasion within not quite my lifetime, but the lifetime of people still living, and conducted a great national green experiment that turned the clock backward on all the constant 24-hour-a-day incitements to buy and consume and to privilege wealth and commodities above community and human relationships. And that great green experiment was called the Second World War. Because in the Second World War, you had to suddenly turn everything upside down. And I was going to write a book on this at one point. I did do a little article in Sarah Magazine. It was amazing to look at the home front in the Second World War. Colorado, for instance, all the Republicans running for the state legislature in 1944 promised that they would hitchhike everywhere in the state to address rallies. They would not drive. They'd conserve rubber. Only time in American history when everybody was encouraged to hitchhike or pick up hitchhikers. Just like the British had their victory bike, bikes suddenly became a preferred mode of transportation. My older sister remembers being in high school during the Second World War, knitting sweaters for airmen as she sat in class in her high schools. Americans grew victory gardens. Although I must admit, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't turn out too well. She was at the White House, I guess because it was burnt by the British, as you know, during the War of 1812. It's very bad soil. She had the rose garden torn out to plant crops to show solidarity with ordinary Americans. She couldn't grow anything. And she had to get Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, to bring in experts from the Agriculture Department. The solution? Excavate the rose garden. Roses grew, but corn wouldn't. They had to bring in entirely fresh new soil and plant it. In New York City, Mayor LaGuardia organized a crusade. He got the kids of New York City, all the school kids, to clean up every piece of rubbish and garbage in the city, recycling everything that was usable in the war effort. People took old Nellie out of the stable, hooked her up again to, the carriage. In Los Angeles, there's an immense project in planting flowers to raise the morale of servicemen in Los Angeles. But it was even more serious than that. It set up a department of rational consumption. The idea was trying to figure out what people really needed, what people could repair. I don't know if any of you buy clothes from Patagonia, the kind of hip Ventura-based, California-based clothing manufacturer. But the owner of it, Yves Chenard, a tough old rock climber from Yosemite, now made his personal crusade not to get you to buy new Patagonia clothes every year, but to repair them. He set up repair facilities. No reason a coat shouldn't last for years. And they actually set up a unit of the federal government, of the department store magnate from Chicago, to try and figure out what were rational patterns of consumption. Not just rationing, but trying to figure out what people really needed. There was a movement toward rational fashion, which was not to end fashion, not to put everybody in gray coveralls like in Russia in 1933, but to figure out what sort of fashion could be homemade, what part of it was, was really necessary, that people really wanted. And then the New York Times did this big survey of women war workers, women who were living in trailers in Long Island, building bombers and fighter planes. And they expected it to show, what they really wanted to do was story showing how women just couldn't wait to get back into the home. None of the women wanted to go back in the home. They liked their jobs. They liked living together with other women. It was truly a liberation. The federal government imposed a maximum house size on new construction. There was, of course, immense housing shortage during the war. Build new homes, but you couldn't build big homes. They had to be modest homes. Co-housing, which is supposedly a great idea of the last 20 years, to practice on a large scale. Millionaires, either voluntarily or in some cases under heavy pressure, to take 3 or 4 military families into their home. They had a big mansion and 4 or 5 families living in it. Marshall Field Jr. had, I don't know how many dozen military families, living in his mansion. And the interesting thing about all this is that while some Americans hated it, like they hated rationing in general, they hated not having enough gasoline, and they went on the black market. There was a large minority of Americans who hated all this stuff. But the indications are that the majority of Americans felt they had a control under their life that they had lost after the First World War. They felt that an old and familiar way of life was returning, where useful things were mended, not thrown away, where people knew the names of their neighbors. I don't want to romanticize this. And this is a profoundly unequal and racist society. But there's an aspect of that wartime history, which I think, just like a utopian college campuses, shows us another possibility, which is not trading, individual consumption and wealth for some great sort of regimented existence, but investing in public influence. This is particularly applicable in poor countries. Might not be able to build everybody really decent shelter right away, but you can build great schools. Whereas my hero is the National Football League. I tell you, I went to a conference one time. The National Football League representative was named Mike Davis, too. Great big, handsome young guy. I got his badge and he got mine. And he came and smiled and said, I think we need to change badges. Not in your life. I'm keeping this badge forever. Mike Davis, NFL. The NFL in Compton built a combination computer learning homework center and gym, weight room. Why isn't there one of those in every neighborhood in the United States that needs it? I mean, we're destroying public space, degrading public services. We're almost criminalizing, or certainly vilifying, people who devote their lives to the public real, like school teachers, for instance, public sector workers, health workers in general. I'll speed this up. Tackling the challenge of sustainable urban design for the whole planet, and not just for a few privileged countries or social groups, requires a vast stage, the imagination, a stage that really hasn't existed, perhaps for almost a century. A willingness to think beyond the horizon of neoliberal capitalism toward a global revolution that reintegrates the labor of the informal working classes as well as the rural poor in the sustainable reconstruction of their built environments and livelihoods. Now, of course, nothing could be more unrealistic, but one either embarks on a journey of hope, believing that collaborations between scientists, architects, engineers, ecologists, and activists can play small but essential roles in making an alternative world possible, or one submits to a future in which our creators, our designers, are just the hireling imagineers of elite alternative existences. Planetary green zones, I'm talking about Baghdad, and you remember the green zone and the red zone. Planetary green zones may offer pharaonic opportunities for the monumentalization of individual visions, kilometer-high skyscrapers in Dubai. But the moral questions of architecture, planning, and urbanism as a whole can only be resolved in the tenements and the sprawl of the red zones. Last thesis. From this perspective, only a return to explicitly utopian thinking can clarify the minimal conditions for the preservation of human solidarity in the face of convergent planetary crisis. We must be able to envision alternative configurations of agents, practices, and social relations, and this in turn requires that we suspend the political economic assumptions that chain us to the present. But utopianism is not necessarily millenarianism, or is it just confined to the soapbox and the pulpit? One of the most encouraging developments in that emergent intellectual space, where science and activists discuss the impacts of global warming and development, has been a new willingness to advocate the necessary rather than the merely practical. A growing chorus of expert voices warn us that either we fight for impossible solutions to the increasingly entangled crisis of urban poverty and climate change, or become ourselves complicit in a de facto triage of humanity. The UN Development Report, regularly the most eloquent UN documents, warns that, quote, the future of human solidarity depends on a massive aid program to help developing countries adapt to climate shocks. The report calls for removing, quote, the obstacles to the rapid disbursement of the low-carbon technologies needed to avoid dangerous climate change. The world's poor cannot be left to sink or swim with their own resources, while rich countries protect their citizens behind climate defense fortifications. Put bluntly, it continues, the world's poor and future generations cannot afford the complacency and prevarication that continue to characterize international negotiations on climate change. Quote, the refusal to act decisively on behalf of all humanity, UN says, would be a moral failure on a scale unparalleled in history. Now, of all I've been saying, it sounds a bit like an archaic or a sentimental call to the barricades, an echo from classroom streets 50 years ago. So be it. Because on the basis of the evidence before us, taking a realistic view of the human prospect, like seeing Medusa's head, would simply turn us into stone. Thank you.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you are enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Friday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sunday at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website ecojusticeradio.org to check out previous shows and guests. Get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to a tribute to the late urban provocateur Mike Davis, curated by myself, Jack Ide, and featuring the late author, urbanist, historian, public intellectual, and commentator on politics, labor, activism, and society. This is Mike Davis quoted in an interview in The New Yorker. I'm a wild, extreme leftist, But to me, it's clear that global capitalism can no longer guarantee the survival of the human race in three ways. It can't generate jobs, it cannot guarantee the public health of the world, and it cannot decarbonize the economy or transfer the resources to adapt the countries that bear the brunt of the greenhouse gases. This seems an age of catastrophe, but also it's an age equipped in an abstract sense with all the tools it needs. Utopia is available to us. If, like me, you lived through the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, you can never discard hope. I've seen social miracles in my life, ones that have stunned me, the courageousness of ordinary people in a struggle. 11 years ago, Bill Moyers brought me on his show and presented me as the last socialist in the United States. Now there are millions of young people who prefer socialism to capitalism. And now we continue with a question and answer by Vijay Prashad, an Indian Marxist historian and commentator. This is from the Feinberg Lecture Series of the University of Massachusetts Amherst History Department in 2020.
Mike Davis, gone California, gone. I think a lot of people are wondering, is California gone? Are people going to pack their cars and do a reverse Dust Bowl, drive back to the American South or to the Midwest from whence their ancestors came, or perhaps get on a plane and fly to Asia or somewhere else, buying oceanfront property in southern Arizona? I mean, is California finished?
We're not thinking of going to the Midwest, to Canada. Canada may emerge as a superpower thanks to global warming. The point that I've tried to make in this talk, in many articles and talks I've given recently about fire, is simply this. Climate change is bringing about major, irreversible transformations in vegetation and fauna. And while we can certainly do things to mitigate fire conditions, it's impossible for us to change that fact. And that's a worldwide fact, whether it's peatlands in eastern Siberia, whether it's the Fertile Crescent, which scientist Lamont Doherty will tell you isn't the Fertile Crescent anymore because of climate change, a fact that has contributed to an exodus of rural people in the Middle East, become a major factor in the wars of the region, whether it's in the Caribbean, which will suffer massive drying, as well as Central America, where drought refugees from Honduras are already camped out 12 miles away from where I speak, in shantytowns in Tijuana, trying to desperately cross the border to the U.S. All this is the reality that our world system and mode of production have brought upon us. And of course, there are things we can do, but we have to accept the kind of damage that is now built in and absolutely unavoidable.
You know, it reminds me of Mahmoud Mamdani's book on Darfur, where he argued that a point that has been neglected in the uproar around the attacks in Darfur is the desiccation of the Sahara. The Sahel region and the increase, the creeping southward of the Sahara. You know, I've seen that personally in Niger and in Chad, and you just see, agriculture becoming impossible. A lot of your talk and a lot of, what is happening in the Sahel region of Africa reminds me of Alfred Crosby's book, Ecological Imperialism. The sense that these are just things we're going to have to learn to deal with, that there is we've crossed a barrier. There's a lot of people asking questions, what should we do? Should we have well-timed grazing to manage invasive bromes and things like that? I mean, you used the word just now saying you can mitigate things, but you can't reverse the tide. I want you to say that again, in a way that is clear to people.
Well, the big question, of course, is who has the power or resource to mitigate? And obviously, the poorest quarter of humanity doesn't have those resources. That's the part of humanity that lives in countries that have contributed only minuscule amounts of greenhouse gases that stand in the way of the most catastrophic effects, particularly in agriculture. The Indus Valley is the largest irrigation system in the world, supporting 70 to 90 million people. I forget how many. And it's in great danger from the early melting of glaciers and snowpacks and from desiccation. And it's hard to find a region in the world, except for Canada, which will see a great northern expansion of agriculture, and trees will move north. That isn't in the crosshairs. The problem is that the countries and the rich classes in those countries that are responsible for opposing and preventing effective action on climate change, they have no rational actor incentive to aid the poor. So built into all of this is a kind of incipient genocide. And we see it all around us. Like I say, 12 miles from me is the fence, the border fence, to repel people who have no choice but to leave their traditional homes in the search of food, water, and some form of employment. And the Iron Curtain has been replaced by a great wall of capitalism everywhere. I mean, look at Australia, Fortress Australia, the concentration camps that's built on Papuan Islands, and so on. That's why I believe that in all things we have to act in name of the unity of the human race and in the name of what's necessary, not what's realistic or seems possible at the present. And this is a consciousness, I believe, that deeply permeates the generation that my younger children belong to and their friends all around the world. Meanwhile, older generations in the United States and Europe and elsewhere live by the principle of consuming all the good things of the earth in their lifetime and leaving nothing behind. I think that we're set on a terminal course right now. People who believe that, well, Biden will be elected and democratic capitalism will get its act together and we'll go back to a new period of growth and happiness. I mean, this is a foolish illusion at best, at a time when low-wage workers in this country, I mean, they went to bed in March of this year. It's 2001. They woke up the next morning and looked out the window. It was 1933, and that's unlikely to change.
You know, Mike, I mean, Walter Benjamin had a beautiful line where he said the socialist imagination isn't to make the train of society go faster, but to pull hard at the handbrake. You know, that insight seems more and more prescient. As you said, getting growth started might be exactly part of the problem. You know, part of the solution might lie in changing everything. I mean, I happen to know your daughter. She's a very sensitive person, a book editor, a reader, somebody who likes ideas. I mean, this is the kind of generation that's coming up, sensitive people who are not interested necessarily in being vacuum cleaners of the planet's resources. Think a little bit with me about this idea of socialism as pulling up the handbrake rather than accelerating the train.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to be more precise about what socialism is. Socialism is the democratization of economic power and investments, the power that's now invested in, say, the 500 largest corporations in the world that control our fate in so many, many different ways. And I was a little bit critical of the Occupy movement because the stress was almost entirely on income inequality rather than the question of economic power, of, for instance, nationalizing the banks, of which there was a real opportunity in 2008. You didn't even need to be a socialist to believe in this. Ireland temporarily nationalized their banks. There have been many opportunities to expand public ownership and to democratize public institutions that weren't taken. But the big question that you're asking is kind of haunted the environmental left for a long time. How can we guarantee to every person on this planet a high quality of existence, given that the footprint of industrial capitalism or state socialism exceeds the planet? I think that's how some people would describe it. And I wrote something once called Who Will Build the Ark? that the solution lies in the socialization of consumption and in the city, real cities, not suburbanized cities like American cities. I mean, think of your campus. I haven't been to UMass Amherst, but my impression is probably very pretty park-like campus. I don't know if that's true or not. But on a typical campus, students, including married graduate students, live very modestly in a shared room or an apartment, a small house. But look at the social infrastructure for recreation, knowledge, and human interaction around them. Magnificent swimming pools, athletic facilities, great libraries. And what to the utopian socialist Charles Fourier was most important, high degrees of promiscuity. Fourier defined promiscuity as the intimacy of strangers. So easy to be in love on a campus, and so much harder to be isolated than it is for single poor people, aging people in most American cities. By embracing this kind of model, which was the subject of an intense debate and experimental practice from William Morris in the 1880s down through the Russian constructivists and Red Vienna in the 1920s, trying to create an alternative urbanism built upon socialized consumption and public affluence. I mean, even in the grim conditions of the 1920s in the Soviet Union, when people were crammed in often two families in a single apartment, and the means for transforming residential life were very slim, the constructivists built these workers' palaces, cinema, sports facilities, libraries, and so on, next to every large factory. And they were magnificent. They were the kind of Notre Dames of a socialist regime. So I believe that ultimately there's no real contradiction against everyone on this planet's rights to a meaningful social role in employment and to the things that are necessary in life, which I assume includes, running shoes and and jeans and maybe your cell phone and stuff. There's no reason we can't guarantee this. The environmentalists have been wrong about this all along. And of course, there's a hardcore of them who embrace the simply Malthusian version that those people who are in the lifeboats stay in it and we can't take anybody else aboard. That is an almost neo-fascist mentality.
It's also not true because, we know the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has told us there's enough food on the planet, and yet 3 billion people, almost 3 billion people are hungry. They're hungry because they don't have money, not because there's not enough food. And I'm very sensitive to what you said, Mike, about rethinking ways in which we live and our personal ambitions for how we want to live. Because I think this is what people around the planet, many by dint of compulsion, have to think about, because more and more people are losing their jobs permanently in the pandemic, and their way of life, their quality of life is deteriorating. It's going to be very easy to convince people to rethink what life should be when your life is deteriorating so rapidly. It seems to me this is a perfect time to talk again about these broad questions about how we should organize things. I mean, what you talked about the real estate market in California, for instance, and the way in which people want to defend their houses at the edge of where it's impossible to live, that is not only, of course, the problem. The problem is much graver than that, which is that the ambitions that capitalism has provided people outstrip our capacity to live as, a species on the planet Earth.
Well, I mean, capitalism can no longer create meaningful social occupations for people with income sufficient to a decent standard of living. We know that the majority of the urban workforces of South America and Africa and in some parts of South Asia are informal workers, which is a kind of euphemism for structural unemployment, getting by the best they can. That number is increasing dramatically. And even in the so-called new industrial countries, the NICs of 10 or 15 years ago, because they turned mainly to commodity exports to China, their industries have shrunk. Sao Paulo
instead of the booming industrial center it once was, shows signs of becoming rustful. So the system no longer needs us to exploit us, and it, in a sense, makes a large minority of humanity kind of surplus the requirements of accumulation on a global scale. Capitalism is incapable, or private medicine and big pharma is incapable of translating revolutionary advances in biological design into public health. Capitalism, in the current model of agriculture, cannot bring about the 50% increase in grain production that the AFO has argued for years is necessary to feed the population in mid-century. One of the great unasked questions in the debates, of course, is nuclear disarmament, which is almost totally marginalized and forgotten. Yet it seems almost inevitable that we'll see at least a regional nuclear exchange within the next generation, if not sooner. We could increase the list, but at each crucial point, human survival is directly put in question by the concentration of economic power and by the use of nationalism to manipulate the masses. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think my youngest daughter and her brother are still in high school, absolutely right. They only want to talk about radical change. They don't have time for anything else. They won't buy into any incremental pattern. So we need to return to the train of the kind of radical imagination of creating a new civilization, which was done in parts, experimental, but it was done. And for 50 years, anarchists, socialists, and others dreamt that dream and tried to make it real. So I think anything short of a utopian imagination is a kind of treason to the future right now.
I mean, honestly, I'm with the high school students and with anybody who wants to dream, a mad dream, because a mad dream is a lot better than what looks like a sane reality. Mike Davis, this has been an incredible hour and 20 minutes, half an hour. You end The Monster Enters with a line I want to read as a way to close out our event. You say, now with a real monster at our door, and I'm not just thinking about COVID-19, I'm thinking about the California forest fires, I'm thinking about the pandemic of hunger and poverty and so on. Now with a real monster at our door, as terrible as in any science fiction, will we wake up in time? Thanks a lot for a really thoughtful and very valuable presentation.
Thank you to our featured guest, Mike Davis, from recordings by UMass Amherst and Rhodes College. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been a tribute to the late urban provocateur, Mike Davis. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal350, and Adventures in Waste. If you like what you have heard and you want others to be informed, well, you know what to do. Subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Eit. Producer and co-host, Jessica Aldridge. Co-host, Carrie Kim. And engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.